The cold of the stone floor seeped through the thin soles of Hella's shoes, a deep and lasting chill that felt like a promise of the life to come. She stood in the shadowed archway of the great hall, a lone figure in a dress that had been fine a season ago, now just a reminder of all she had lost. The air itself was different here in Alpha Conrad's stronghold, thick with the scent of power, of pine and iron, and of 1,000 unspoken rules she was now expected to obey. Her gaze, against her will, was drawn to the center of the room, to the man who owned the very breath in her lungs. Alpha Conrad was not what she had expected. He wasn't a roaring beast holding court, but a still, potent force at the head of a scarred wooden table. His council, a circle of older wolves with faces like carved granite, were speaking, their voices a low, demanding rumble. The quotas are not being met in the northern sectors. One of them, a man with silver streaking his dark beard, stated, "We must increase the tithe, force them to yield more." Hella held her breath, expecting agreement. This was the way of alphas, wasn't it? To take more, always more. But Conrad's voice, when it came, was low and firm, cutting through the stuffy air like a blade. No. The single word held absolute finality. He leaned forward, his broad shoulders blocking the firelight. The northern families are still recovering from the last frost. Their children are thin. To demand more from them is not leadership, it is predation. A ripple of displeasure went around the table. Sentiment is a luxury, Conrad. Strength requires a pack that is not starving. Conrad's fist came down on the table, not with a bang, but a solid, resonant thud that silenced the room. We do not strengthen the whole by bleeding one part of it dry. The tithe stands as it is. We will find the resources elsewhere. Hella felt something strange and unwelcome twist in her chest. It was admiration. Here was a man who could crush any one of them with a single hand. Yet he was using his power to shield the weakest among them. He was defending people like her own family, whose failure had led her to this very hall. The irony was a bitter pill. His eyes, a stormy gray, swept across the room and for a single, heart-stopping moment, landed on her. There was no curiosity in that look, no recognition of a person. It was the same fleeting glance one might give a piece of furniture that had been moved, a note of its presence, and then a swift dismissal. She was nothing to him. A settlement, a tribute, paid for a debt. The resentment she had been nursing flared, hot and bright, a shield against the treacherous pull of his integrity. As the council grumbled their reluctant acceptance, Hella looked down at her own hands, clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She was here to serve, to scrub his floors and mend his clothes, to be invisible. But as she stood there, the cold stone leaching the warmth from her body, a different, more dangerous thought began to form. She had seen the greed in the councilman's eyes. She had seen the lone stand Conrad had taken against them, and she knew, with a certainty that turned her blood to ice, that the man who fought so fiercely for his pack was surrounded by wolves who would not hesitate to tear him down. The days fell into a harsh, monotonous rhythm. From the first pale light of dawn until the deep quiet of night, Hella's world was reduced to tasks. She scrubbed endless stone floors until her knees ached and her fingers were raw. She carried heavy baskets of laundry, the scent of strange wolves clinging to her clothes. But amidst the drudgery, there was one place that felt almost like a refuge: the castle's herb gardens. Tucked against a sun-warmed southern wall, the garden was a riot of green and fragrance. It was here, with her hands buried in the rich, dark soil, that she could almost forget she was property. Here she was Hella, the healer, the one who knew which leaf could mend a fever and which root could soothe an aching muscle. It was her only solace. One afternoon, the sun was warm on her back as she carefully harvested lavender for the linen stores. The gentle hum of bees was the only sound, lulling her into a rare moment of peace. Then, voices, low and urgent, cut through the calm. They came from the other side of a tall, thick hedge of rosemary. She froze, her fingers still curled around a purple stalk. She recognized one voice immediately. It was smooth as oil, with a mocking undertone that always set her teeth on edge. Lucas, Conrad's brother. The pieces are all in place, Lucas was saying. The ceremony provides the perfect chaos. No one will question a tragic accident amidst so much celebration. Hella's blood ran cold. She crouched lower, making herself small. And the delivery method? Another voice asked, one she thought belonged to Councilman Thorin, the man with the silver-streaked beard. It will be in the wine, a special vintage, reserved for the Alpha's table alone, Lucas replied. The beauty of it is its subtlety. It doesn't act like a common poison. It mimics a sudden, devastating weakness. By the time anyone realizes it's not natural, it will be far too late. A third voice chimed in. You're certain it's untraceable? The wolfsbane strain from the eastern marshes. It's notoriously difficult to refine. Hella's breath hitched. Wolfsbane, but not just any kind. The eastern marsh variant was called Shadow's Kiss by healers. It didn't kill with convulsions or agony. It quietly unraveled the life force from within, leaving its victim frail and exhausted until their great heart simply stopped. It was a healer's nightmare. A poison for assassins who valued silence and deniability. Completely untraceable after 6 hours, Lucas confirmed, a note of pride in his vile whisper. It simply looks like his legendary strength finally failed him. A fitting end for a warrior who thought himself untouchable. The conversation shifted to other matters. Distractions, loyal guards being assigned elsewhere, the swift consolidation of power after the tragedy. But Hella heard no more. Her mind was screaming, piecing together the horrifying puzzle. The ceremony was the upcoming mating celebration. The obstacle was Conrad. The rare poison was Shadow's Kiss. She stayed crouched in the dirt long after their footsteps had faded, the lavender in her hand crushed. Its scent suddenly cloying and sickening. Torn didn't begin to describe the war inside her. Why should she care? This man, this Alpha, owned her. He had looked at her and seen nothing. His brother's betrayal was his own problem. But then the memory of his voice, firm and resolute, defending the northern families, flashed behind her eyes. She saw the lone stand he had taken against the circling sharks of his council. He was a brute, yes, but a just one. He protected the weak, and for that, he was to be murdered by the very men he called brothers. A desperate, reckless resolve hardened within her. She had to warn him. It was a stupid, hopeless gesture. He would never believe the word of a disgruntled tribute over his own brother and trusted counsel. He would likely punish her for spreading lies, just as he'd promised to do if she caused trouble. The risk was immense. But as she looked down at her soil-stained hands, hands that could heal, she knew she had no choice. To stay silent would be to let the last flicker of integrity in this castle be snuffed out. She would warn him, even if it destroyed what little freedom she had left. It was no longer about debt or duty. It was about the strange, unwelcome pull in her chest that refused to let this good, blind man walk to his slaughter. The scent of crushed lavender still clung to her fingers as Hella stood before the great oak door to Conrad's private study. It smelled like fear now. She raised a trembling hand and knocked, the sound absurdly small against the solid wood. A rumble from within granted entry. The room was as formidable as the man himself. Books lined the walls, their leather spines a silent judgment on her own inadequacy. A massive fireplace dominated one wall, and before it stood Conrad, not looking at her, but staring into the flames. He held a goblet, his knuckles white around the stem. "Well," he said, his voice a low thunder that vibrated in the quiet room. "This is an unusual request for a tribute. Speak." Hella's mouth went dry. She forced the words out. They tumbled from her lips in a rushed, desperate whisper. "Alpha, I was in the garden. I heard them. Your brother, Lucas, and Councilman Thorin. They spoke of the mating ceremony. They planned to poison you, a rare wolfsbane, in your wine. They called it removing the obstacle." The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Conrad slowly turned from the fire. His gray eyes, which she had seen blaze with protective fury, were now cold, flat stones. The disappointment in them was a physical blow. "Poison," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "My brother, my own blood." He took a step toward her, and the sheer size of him seemed to suck the air from the room. "Do you take me for a fool, or do you simply think so little of our bonds?" "I speak the truth," she pleaded, her voice gaining a shred of strength. "I heard them." "The truth?" he boomed, suddenly angry, the sound making her flinch. "The truth is that your family could not meet their obligations. The truth is that you were given as payment, and you stand there now, in my home, and spew venom about the only family I have left." He slammed the goblet down on the mantelpiece, wine sloshing over the rim like blood. "This is your bitterness talking, a pathetic attempt to sow discord because your pride is wounded." Tears she refused to shed burned behind her eyes. "It is not pride, I swear it." "Loyalty is the foundation of this pack," he lectured, his voice cutting through her like a lash. "The loyalty of a brother, the loyalty of a council, the loyalty of every wolf to their alpha, and you, an omega who has been here 5 minutes, believe you can shatter that with a whispered lie?" He moved closer until he loomed over her, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You will listen to me now. You will never speak of this again. To anyone. When I return from the mating ceremony, if I hear even a whisper of this treachery from any corner of this castle, I will hold you responsible. The punishment will be severe. Do you understand?" She stood there, trembling, not from fear of his punishment, but from the devastating realization dawning upon her. He couldn't see it. He was so fiercely loyal, so bound by his idea of family and pack, that the concept of betrayal from within was simply invisible to him. His strength, his greatest asset, was also his most profound blindness. "I understand," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. He dismissed her with a sharp wave of his hand, turning back to his fire as if she had already ceased to exist. Hela walked out of the study, her legs feeling numb. The devastation was a cold weight in her stomach. He despised her. He thought her a liar, a snake in his midst. But as the cold certainty of his dismissal settled over her, another, stranger feeling began to bloom beneath the hurt. It was a love that felt like a shard of glass in her heart, sharp, painful, and utterly undeniable. He was going to walk into a trap, trusting the very wolves who held the knife, and he had no one but her. His rejection hadn't broken her resolve. It had forged it into steel. He might never believe her. He might even hate her for what she had to do next. But as she made her way back to the shadows of the castle, her mind was already racing, discarding fear and planning for survival. His survival. She would save the stubborn, blind, honorable Alpha, even if it was the last thing she ever did. The castle had fallen into a deceptive quiet. The frantic preparations for the mating ceremony were complete, and now an expectant hush lay over the stronghold, broken only by the distant, happy chatter of early arrivals from neighboring packs. For Hela, the silence was a screaming thing. It was the calm before the storm that only she knew was coming. While the rest of the world slept, dreaming of celebration, she was a solitary figure in the cold, stone herb room, fighting a war in the flickering light of a single candle. Her hands moved with a frantic, precise speed, measuring, crushing, mixing. The air was thick with the scent of earth, bitterness, and a faint, medicinal sweetness. Her grandmother's voice was her guide, a memory as clear as if the old woman stood beside her. "Shadow's kiss is a traitor's poison. Hela," the voice whispered in her mind. "It does not storm the gates, it slithers under them. To counter a poison that mimics weakness, you must not fight with brute force, but with cleverness. You must support the body's own spirit, give it the tools to fight the decay from within." Her fingers, stained green, found the milk thistle seeds. She ground them to a fine powder, her movements sharp and efficient. This would guard his liver, the organ that would first try to battle the venom. As she worked, a memory surfaced, unbidden and vivid. The mortar and pestle scraped, and suddenly she was back in the great hall weeks ago, hidden in a shadowed corner. A group of pack widows stood before the council, their heads bowed. Councilman Thorin's voice was cold, proposing to claim their lands for a new armory. The women trembled, powerless. Then Conrad had spoken. He didn't shout. He simply stood, his presence filling the room. "We do not honor our fallen warriors by making their families homeless," he had said. his tone leaving no room for argument. "The land is theirs. This discussion is over." The raw, relieved gratitude on the women's faces had been alight in the grim hall. Next, the gritty black charcoal. She measured it carefully. Too much would be suspicious, too little, useless. It was a scavenger, meant to absorb the poison before it could sink its claws too deep. Her hands shook as she poured it, the fine black dust a reminder of the darkness she was trying to hold back. Another flashback, this one softer, more intimate. She had been crossing a sun-drenched courtyard, her arms full of linens. A small, orphaned pup, no older than 5, had tripped and fallen, his knee scraping raw on the cobblestones. His wail echoed. Before any nursemaid could react, Conrad was there. He had knelt, his large warrior's frame looking absurdly gentle, and scooped the boy up. He hadn't just patted his head and moved on. He had examined the scrape, spoken in a low, calming rumble, and pulled a sweet from his own pocket, placing it in the child's grubby hand. The boy's tears had turned to a wobbly smile. It was a small, unseen act of kindness that had cracked something open inside her. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the precious golden root shavings. This was the most critical ingredient, a powerful stimulant to trick his heart into beating when the poison tried to convince it to stop. It was her last, desperate line of defense. This was the man they wanted to kill. Not a cruel tyrant, but a leader of unyielding principle and unexpected tenderness. A man who defended the defenseless and comforted a crying child. The love she felt for him was no longer a quiet admiration. It was a fierce, desperate, and terrifying force that gave her the courage to commit treason. As the first sliver of dawn painted the horizon gray, her work was complete. In a small clay dish lay a thick, dark paste. The scent of life and death mingled into one. It was a fragile, desperate hope made tangible. The walk to the Alpha's private kitchen was a journey through a gauntlet of fear. Every shadow seemed to hold Lucas's mocking eyes. Her heart pounded a violent rhythm against her ribs. She found the ornate ceramic jug that held his morning wine, a rich red vintage from his personal vineyard. This was the point of no return. Her breath hitched. If she was wrong, she was poisoning him herself. If she was caught, it meant a traitor's death. But the alternative, letting him drink pure, unadulterated death, was unthinkable. With a final, shuddering prayer to the moon goddess, she scooped the paste onto her finger and swirled it into the deep crimson liquid. She watched it dissolve, her secret, her devotion, her love, vanishing into the wine that was meant to be his doom. Her hands would not stop trembling as she slipped away, a ghost returning to the shadows. The feast had not yet begun, the betrayal not yet sprung, but she had already fired the first silent shot in the war to save her Alpha's life. The air at the mating ceremony was thick with the scent of roasting meat, sweet wine, and the wild, happy energy of hundreds of wolves celebrating. Under the great canopy of ancient oaks, Conrad moved like a king through his domain, his presence a bedrock of stability amidst the joy. He found the newly mated pairs, their hands clasped and eyes bright with hope for the future. "May the moon goddess bless your union," he recited, his voice a familiar, grounding rumble that carried over the festivities. "May your bond be strong in the face of winter, and may your den be filled with the laughter of pups. The pack is strengthened by your love." The traditional words, which he had spoken many times before, felt different today. He looked at the young couples, at their unwavering trust in each other, and felt a pang of something unidentifiable. It was a vulnerability he quickly shoved aside. The feast began in earnest. Laughter rang out, music swelled, and Conrad took his place at the high table, his brother Lucas to his right. Lucas was in a particularly fine mood, filling Conrad's goblet himself with a rich dark wine from a special pitcher. "To your health, brother," Lucas said, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "And to the strength of the pack." Conrad drank. The wine was strong, with a faint, underlying bitterness he attributed to the particular grape. He drank again, toasting to the new pairs, to the pack, to the future. Lucas watched him, his attention a silent, predatory weight. It started subtly. A strange, heavy warmth spread through his limbs, a languidness that was at odds with the lively music. He set his goblet down, thinking he simply needed food. But then a wave of dizziness hit him, making the torchlight swim and blur. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. This was no simple fatigue. This was a draining, a sapping of his legendary strength that felt like sand slipping through his fingers. His vision began to tunnel, the joyful noises of the feast becoming a distorted, muffled roar in his ears. He saw Lucas turn to him, a mask of concern on his face. "Brother, you look pale." The words sounded distant, fake. Then, chaos. From the crowd of dancing, celebrating wolves, figures emerged. They moved with a lethal purpose, their eyes cold, blades glinting in the firelight. They were upon the high table in a heartbeat. "Assassins! Protect the Alpha!" Lucas roared, leaping to his feet and drawing his sword. His personal guard surged forward, their defense a flurry of dramatic clashing steel. It was a magnificent performance. Lucas's sword flashed, parrying blows, his movements fierce and grand. But through his fading, blurring vision, Conrad saw the truth. Lucas's blade never quite found its mark. It always deflected, always slid harmlessly away, always positioned the attackers closer to him. The guards, too, seemed to be everywhere at once, yet they always left a path open, herding the killers toward their faltering Alpha. A blade sliced his arm, another his thigh. The pain was dull, distant. His body was failing, his muscles turning to water. But deep within, a flicker of resistance remained. A core of strength that should have been extinguished by now was still there, a stubborn ember fighting against the tide of poison. It was just enough. With a final, gut-wrenching effort, Conrad summoned the shift. It was not the powerful, seamless transformation he was known for. It was a painful, ragged tear, his human form fighting to hold on as the wolf fought to break free. But he did it. A massive, dark-furred wolf now stood where the Alpha had been, its legs unsteady, its breath coming in ragged pants. The assassins hesitated, stunned that he still had the power to shift. Lucas's face, for a split second, showed pure, unadulterated shock, before twisting back into a mask of furious defense. Conrad didn't stay to fight. That was what they expected. That was what would get him killed. Using the last of the borrowed strength Hela's herbs had given him, he turned and lunged away from the table, crashing through the stunned crowd and into the dark, welcoming embrace of the forest. He ran, his world reduced to the pounding of his own heart and the desperate, single-minded command to get home. To get to the one place his addled mind screamed was safe, before the darkness waiting at the edges of his vision finally swallowed him whole. The cold night air was a knife against Hela's skin as she leaned against the stone windowsill, her gaze fixed on the distant tree line. The celebration's fires were mere pinpricks in the darkness, too far away to see anything but the occasional movement of torchlight. Every fiber of her being was stretched taut, waiting for a sign, a sound, anything. Then she saw it. A massive, dark shape stumbled from the forest's edge. It was moving with a lurching, broken gait she would recognize anywhere, even in the pale moonlight. Conrad, but not as the powerful Alpha. This was the flight of a wounded animal. Her heart seized. He was supposed to be at the feast for hours more. He was early. That could only mean one thing. She didn't wait to see more. Gathering her skirts, she flew down the winding staircase, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the cold steps. She burst through a side door just as the colossal wolf reached the main gates. With a final shuddering breath, the great beast collapsed. There was a shimmer in the air, a sound of tearing reality, and then it was just Conrad, lying broken and still on the frozen ground, naked in the torn remnants of his formal clothes. Conrad! His name was a sob torn from her throat. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands immediately going to his neck. A pulse, thready and weak, but there. His skin was clammy and pale, his breathing so shallow it was barely visible. The scent of the poison was on him, a faint metallic tang beneath the smell of blood and sweat. It was a smell she knew from her grandmother's warnings, the scent of something crafted in a laboratory, not foraged from a marsh. This was military grade, expensive, sophisticated, the kind of thing only someone with deep connections and deeper pockets could obtain. He was a dead weight, a mountain of muscle and bone. "I have to get you inside," she whispered, more to herself than to him. She hooked her hands under his arms, her slender frame straining with the effort. She pulled, her muscles screaming, her shoes slipping on the icy cobblestones. It was an impossible task, moving this man who was twice her size, but terror gave her a desperate strength. Inch by agonizing inch, she dragged him across the threshold, into the relative shelter of the castle's entry hall, leaving a trail of disturbed frost in their wake. Getting him up to his private chambers was a feat of pure will. She half dragged, half carried him up the servants' staircase, her breath coming in ragged gasps, every step a battle against his dead weight and her own rising panic. Finally, she collapsed with him onto the thick furs of his bed. There was no time to rest. She lit every candle in the room, creating a pool of light against the oppressive dark. Her hands, now steady with purpose, worked quickly. She cut away his torn tunic, revealing the deep, oozing cuts on his arm and thigh. But these were not the real threat. The real enemy was inside him, working its way toward his heart. She applied poultices of yarrow and witch hazel to the wounds to stop the bleeding, her movements efficient. Then she turned to the true battle. She forced his jaw open, tipping a carefully measured antidote of golden root and milk thistle down his throat, stroking his neck to make him swallow. She bathed his fevered skin with cool cloths, monitoring the erratic flutter of his pulse at his wrist. The night stretched on, an endless vigil fought in the silent candlelit room. Her world shrank to the rise and fall of his chest, the weak beat under her fingertips. She was a sentry against the shadow trying to claim him. In the deepest hour of the night, his stillness broke. A groan rattled in his chest, and his head tossed on the pillow. His lips moved, forming soundless words. She leaned closer, her ear almost to his mouth. "Lies," he muttered, his voice a dry, cracked whisper. "All lies." Hella's breath caught. Her hand, which had been gently wiping his brow, stilled. Then, clearer, laced with the pain of betrayal even in his unconscious state, he breathed a single word. "Hella!" It was not a call for help. It was an accusation, a lament. In the landscape of his nightmares, he was still in his study, and she was still the Omega he believed was trying to poison his pack with deceit. A fresh wave of anguish washed over her, so potent it was a physical ache. He was fighting for his life, and in his mind, she was the enemy. The tears she had been holding back finally fell, hot and silent, landing on the furs beside his head. Yet, she did not pull away. She continued her work, her touch gentle, her resolve hardening like diamond. He could believe her a liar. He could hate her. It didn't matter. She would still fight for him. She would still use every ounce of her knowledge, every shred of her strength, to drag him back from the brink. Because her love for him was no longer a choice. It was the very reason she drew breath. The first sliver of dawn was painting the sky a sickly gray when the sound of returning riders echoed through the castle courtyard. The celebration was over, but this was not a joyous return. The noise was sharp, purposeful, and full of a grim authority that made Hella's blood run cold. She was still at Conrad's bedside, her hand on his forehead, monitoring the fragile thread of his life. The doors to his chamber burst open without warning. Lucas stood there, his armor smeared with dirt and what looked like blood, his face a mask of grim triumph and manufactured grief. Behind him were two of his most loyal guards, their expressions hard. "Seize her," Lucas commanded, his voice cutting through the room's quiet. "No," Hella cried, stumbling back from the bed as the guards grabbed her arms with bruising force. "What are you doing?" "He needs me. What he needs is to be protected from traitors like you," Lucas snarled, his eyes sweeping over his brother's unconscious form with a flicker of satisfaction. He turned to the guards. "Take her to the dungeons. I will address the council immediately." She was dragged, kicking and screaming from the room. Her last sight was of Conrad, pale and helpless, completely alone. The cold stone of the dungeon was a brutal shock after the warmth of the sick room. They threw her into a cell, the iron door clanging shut with a sound of finality. Hours later, she was hauled before the emergency council. The same men who had watched Conrad defend the weak now looked at her with open hostility. Lucas stood at the head of the table, having seamlessly assumed his brother's place. "The evidence is clear," Lucas began, his tone dripping with false sorrow. He held up a small, empty pouch. "This was found hidden among the Omega's belongings. It bears the residue of a rare wolfsbane, the same poison that nearly claimed my brother's life." Hela's eyes widened. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. "Furthermore," Lucas continued, his gaze sweeping over the council, "multiple witnesses saw her in a heated argument with Alpha Conrad just yesterday. She was heard making threats, bitter over her family's status." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "We all know her family failed to pay their taxes. We all know the resentment that festered there. This was not just an assassination attempt. It was an act of revenge." "I was trying to warn him." Hela's voice was raw, tearing from her throat. "I told him about you." "I told him you were the traitor," Councilman Thorin sneered, his lip curling. "A convenient story now, girl. You claim you warned him of a plot, yet you are the one with knowledge of poisons. You are the one with a motive. You are the one he was going to punish upon his return." The logic, twisted and evil, was closing around her like a trap. They had taken the truth and warped it into the perfect proof of her guilt. "I saved him," she screamed, her voice cracking with desperation. "The poison was in the wine at the ceremony. My herbs are the only reason he's still alive. Check the wine amphora. Someone must have—" The amphora was shattered in the chaos. Lucas interrupted smoothly, his eyes cold. "A tragedy that, no evidence left to examine. Only the word of a vengeful Omega against the testimony of your Alpha's own brother and his loyal council." The faces around the table were stone. They were not interested in truth. They were interested in a story that served them. A story that removed Conrad and installed Lucas, who would grant them the power and greed they craved. Her truth was inconvenient. Her screams were the meaningless noise of a bug about to be crushed. "You are a liar and a would-be assassin," Lucas pronounced, his voice booming in the chamber. "You will remain in the dungeons until my brother is well enough to witness your execution, or until you confess to your crimes." As the guards dragged her away once more, her screams turned to broken sobs. They weren't just throwing her in a cell. They were burying the truth with her. And Conrad, in his poisoned sleep, was dreaming that she was the one who had betrayed him. The injustice of it was a physical pain, sharper than any blade, and as the darkness of the dungeon swallowed her, she felt a hope inside her flicker and die. The darkness of the dungeon was absolute, a thick, suffocating blanket that smelled of damp stone, old blood, and despair. For Hela, it became a world of pain measured in the space between heartbeats. The interrogators came for her at irregular intervals, their footsteps echoing like doom in the corridor. They were not rough guards, but cold, efficient men sent by Lucas and the council. Their questions were always the same, a relentless hammer beating against the anvil of her will. "Confess to the poisoning. Admit you acted for your family's revenge. Who were your accomplices?" When her denials came, hoarse and unwavering, the punishment followed. They clamped silver shackles around her wrists. The metal seared her skin, the pain a bright, white-hot agony that made her vision swim and her stomach heave. The scent of her own burning flesh filled the small cell. She bit her lip until it bled to keep from screaming, refusing to give them the satisfaction. When the shackles weren't enough, they used the lash. The whip cracked through the air, landing on her back with a sting that exploded into a fire that consumed every thought. Each strike felt like it was peeling away her very being. She lost count after a dozen, her world narrowing to the cold stone floor beneath her cheek and the coppery taste of blood in her mouth. But through the haze of pain, her mind, her greatest weapon, would not shut down. As they worked her over, she watched them. She saw the bored precision in their eyes. This was a job, a task to complete. They weren't looking for truth. They were manufacturing a confession to legitimize Lucas's rule. This realization was a tiny, cold ember of strength in the frozen darkness. In the brutal silence between sessions, she moved, every motion a fresh agony. Using a sliver of charcoal smuggled to her by a terrified kitchen Omega who risked everything to slip it into her water jug, she marked the stone wall, tracking the days. She needed to know how long Conrad had been unconscious. Her healer's instincts took over. When the guards threw her a stale crust of bread, she would secretly pick the moss from the damp stones in the corner of her cell, knowing which kinds had antiseptic properties. She used a few drops of her precious water to create a paste, applying it to the lash marks on her back to fight infection. The pain was excruciating, but it was a clean pain, a pain of healing, not of breaking. It was during one of these fragile moments of self-care, her body trembling with the effort, that she heard a different set of footsteps, lighter, hesitant. The small slot in the door opened, and a water skin was pushed through, followed by a small, hidden bundle of comfrey leaves, a powerful herb for healing wounds. A young guard's face appeared at the slot for just a moment. It was Floki, a boy barely out of his teens with earnest eyes. He had always been kind, the one who'd sometimes given her an extra apple when she worked in the gardens. "They say you tried to kill him," Floki whispered, his voice thick with confusion and fear. "I saved him," Hela croaked, her throat raw. "Lucas lies. The Alpha still lives only because of me." Floki looked over his shoulder, terrified. "I don't know what to believe. But I served under Alpha Conrad at the border. He was always fair. He saved my life once." He looked at her battered form, the angry burns on her wrists. This is not his way." That small exchange, that flicker of doubt in a loyal heart, was the first piece of evidence she gathered. It was proof that not everyone was blind. It was a spark. As Floki's footsteps faded, Hela clutched the comfrey leaves, a plan beginning to form in her mind, sharp and clear through the pain. She would not break. She would endure this hell. She would heal herself just enough to stay alive. Because she had to get back to Conrad's side. She had to be there when he woke up. And she had to find a way to prove her truth, not with screams in a council chamber, but with cold, hard evidence that even Lucas could not explain away. Floki was a start. A fragile, terrified start, but an ally nonetheless. The world returned to Conrad in pieces. First, a dull, throbbing ache in every muscle. Then, the fuzzy texture of furs against his skin. Finally, the dim light of his own chambers stinging his eyes. He tried to sit up, and a wave of weakness so profound it felt like drowning washed over him. He fell back against the pillows, his breath ragged. He was alive. The how and the why were a tangled blur of pain and firelight, and his brothers shouting. As if summoned by the thought, Lucas was there, hovering at his bedside, his face a masterpiece of concerned relief. "Brother," Lucas breathed, helping him sip some water. "Thank the moon goddess. We thought we'd lost you." "The ceremony," Conrad managed, his voice a rough scrape. "Assassins." "Dealt with," Lucas said smoothly, his hand firm on Conrad's shoulder. "But we uncovered the true viper in our nest. It was the Omega, Hela." Conrad's hazy mind struggled to focus. "Hela. She poisoned your morning wine," Lucas explained, his tone dripping with grim certainty. "We found the evidence hidden among her things. She was bitter about her family's disgrace, angry at you for taking her as tribute. She confessed to everything after her arrest. She confessed. The words should have settled it, but they didn't. They felt wrong." A sharp, discordant note in the fog of his recovery. The memory of her in his study, trembling but unwavering, flashed in his mind. "I speak the truth." Her eyes had been full of fire, not guilt. "I want to see her," Conrad rasped. Lucas's mask slipped for a fraction of a second. "Conrad, you're too weak. She's safely in the dungeons, awaiting your judgment." "There's no need. Now," Conrad interrupted, the command weak but absolute. He pushed himself up, ignoring the protest of his body. He was the Alpha, and he would look his attempted murderer in the eye. Leaning heavily on two guards, his legs trembling with every step, He made the agonizing journey down to the dungeons. The cold, damp air hit him like a blow, the stench of misery making his stomach turn. Lucas led him to a cell, his expression carefully neutral. The sight that met Conrad's eyes stole what little breath he had. Hela was curled on a pile of filthy straw, her dress torn and stained with dark, dried blood. Her wrists were encircled by angry, red burns, silver burns. A fine network of lash marks crisscrossed the bare skin of her back, some still seeping. Her face was pale and bruised, one eye swollen shut. This was not the face of a cunning assassin who had been broken by a quick confession. This was the face of someone who had endured hell. She stirred at the sound of their approach, her one good eye fluttering open. She saw him, and for a moment, there was no fear, no pleading, no hatred. There was only a desperate, searching intensity. Conrad expected her to cry out for mercy, to scream her innocence once more. He braced himself for the lies Lucas had warned him about. But her voice, when it came, was a hoarse, broken whisper that held no concern for herself. "Are you eating it?" she asked. The question was so utterly unexpected, it took him a moment to process it. "What?" "The broth," she insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "The one the kitchen sends to your room. The deep brown one with a scent of thyme and bone marrow. Are you eating it?" Conrad stared at her, utterly bewildered. Here she was, broken and bleeding in a dungeon, accused of trying to murder him. And her first thought was about his meal. I don't know," he stammered. "You must," she whispered, her body sagging back onto the straw, as if the effort of speaking had drained her completely. "I prepared it before they took me. It has golden root and saint's seal. It strengthens the blood, fights the lingering weakness from the poison. You're not healed yet." Silence descended upon the dungeon, thick and heavy. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. Conrad could only stare at the shattered young woman at his feet. A guilty person would be pleading for their life. A vengeful person would be cursing him. Hela, in the face of unimaginable suffering, was worried about his recovery. She was giving him medical instructions from a prison cell. In that moment, the first seed of doubt, small but tenacious, broke through the hard soil of his brother's lies. It was not a full-blown belief in her innocence, not yet. But it was the undeniable, shocking realization that the story he had been told did not fit the broken, selfless woman lying before him. The foundation of Lucas's narrative had just developed a crack. The silence in Conrad's chambers was shattered by a firm, unwelcome knock. Councilman Thorin entered without waiting for a reply, two other senior members flanking him. Their expressions were not of concern for their recovering alpha, but of cold, official business. "Alpha," Thorin began, his voice dripping with a false formality. "The pack cannot wait. Petitions have piled up. Legal matters require your immediate attention. You must address them." Conrad, propped up in bed, felt a familiar dread coil in his stomach. The weakness from the poison was bad enough, but this was a different kind of vulnerability, one he guarded more fiercely than any secret. "Bring them to me later. I will review them," he said, his voice rough. "I'm afraid it cannot wait," Thorin insisted, unrolling a scroll with a flourish. "This, for instance, is a boundary dispute with the Eastern Pack. Their alpha demands a resolution, written in your own hand by sundown. And this," he placed another thicker document on the bed furs, "details the trade agreement with the southern clans. The terms are complex. Your signature is required to ratify it." The papers lay before him like traps. The letters, black and sharp, seemed to writhe and dance on the parchment. He could pick out a few, maybe, but stringing them together into words, into sentences, into meaning, it was an impossible task. His heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. A cold sweat broke out on his brow. Lucas, who had been standing quietly by the window, spoke up. "Brother, the council is right. The pack needs to see your strength. Show them you are still in command." His tone was supportive, but his eyes held a glint of something else, something knowing. They knew. The realization hit Conrad with the force of a physical blow. Lucas had told them. His own brother had handed them the key to his destruction. "Read it to me," Conrad commanded, trying to summon his old authority, but the request sounded like the weakness it was. Thorin's lips curled into a faint, cruel smile. "My Alpha, these are your documents. It would be unseemly for us to read them for you. The pack trusts its leader to know the laws that bind them." Conrad's hand trembled as he reached for the first scroll. He stared at it, his vision blurring. The pressure, the expectant stares of the men, the swirling, meaningless symbols. It all coalesced into a wave of pure panic. He was frozen, exposed, the mighty Alpha, rendered powerless by a page of text. He saw the council members exchange a look. It wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. Thorin cleared his throat, the sound like a judge's gavel. "It is clear, Alpha Conrad, that your condition leaves you unable to perform the basic duties of leadership. For the good of the pack, we must call a vote. In 7 days' time, the council will decide if you are fit to remain as Alpha." The words hung in the air, more lethal than any poison. They hadn't just attacked his strength, they had attacked his very worth. They had taken the secret shame he had carried his entire life and used it as a weapon to unseat him. Without another word, the councilman turned and left. Lucas gave him one last, unreadable look before following. Alone, Conrad slumped back against the pillows. The humiliation burned through him, hotter and more painful than the poison ever had. He felt stripped bare, more powerless now than when he'd been lying on the forest floor, dying. They hadn't just weakened his body. They had shattered the foundation of his rule, and they had done it with a few pieces of paper and his own brother's betrayal. The 7-day countdown had begun, a ticking clock toward his utter ruin. The humiliation was a fire in Conrad's veins, burning away the last of his weakness and leaving behind a hard, desperate resolve. He had nowhere else to turn. The council's smug faces and his brother's betrayal were a cage closing in around him. There was only one person who had shown him a shred of selfless loyalty, and she was locked in his dungeon. He found her in the same state as before, curled on the straw. But her one good eye was open and alert, watching him as he entered the cell. She didn't speak, just waited. The silence was accusing. Conrad's pride stuck in his throat, a painful, immovable lump. An apology was impossible. An admission of being wrong was beyond him. "I have an administrative matter," he finally grunted, the words feeling foreign and clumsy. "Papers that need reviewing." Hela's gaze didn't waver. She understood. She saw right through his fragile pride to the terrified, struggling man beneath. She saw the Alpha who couldn't read. "I can help," she said, her voice still hoarse from screaming. "But not from in here. You must release me to your personal custody. My hands are of no use to you in chains." It was a demand, not a plea. From an Omega to an Alpha. In any other circumstance, it would be unthinkable. Now, it was his only option. "Agreed," he said, the word tasting like ash. Minutes later, she was in his private study, the chains removed from her wrists, but the angry burns still circling them like brutal bracelets. She moved stiffly, each motion pulling at the wounds on her back. Conrad sat behind his large desk, the stack of petitions and scrolls looking like a fortress wall. "Read that one," he commanded, pointing to the first document, his tone brusque to cover his shame. Hela picked it up. Her voice, though soft and damaged, was clear and steady, as she began to read the petition from a farmer whose land had been flooded by a diverted stream. She didn't just recite the words, she read them with feeling, making the man's plight seem real. Conrad listened, his mind, which froze at the sight of text, now sharp and focused. He began to dictate a response, ordering the stream be restored and the farmer compensated. This became their new, secret rhythm. She would read, her voice a patient, steady guide in the quiet room. He would listen, think, and then issue his judgments, which she would carefully transcribe onto fresh parchment. The scratch of her quill was the only sound between them for long moments. He watched her hands, noting how she would sometimes pause to flex her fingers, the silver burns clearly causing her pain, but she never complained. She never rushed him. In these intimate sessions, the walls between them began to crumble. He saw the sharp intelligence in her eyes as she summarized complex legal arguments. He felt her unwavering focus as she helped him navigate the treacherous political waters. This was not the bitter, lying tribute he had dismissed. This was a partner, and through it all, she continued to heal him. She would insist on checking his pulse, on preparing his healing broths herself, refusing to let anyone else do it. He noticed, with a growing knot in his stomach, that she never once tended to her own wounds in his presence. The lash marks on her back remained untreated, the burns on her wrists raw and angry. "See to your own injuries," he said one evening, his voice less harsh than before. She looked up from a trade agreement, her expression serene. "After you are stronger. The poison still lingers in your tissues. My body can wait." Her selflessness was a constant, quiet rebuke to his earlier cruelty. She was prioritizing his health over her own agony, just as she had in the dungeon. With every petition she read, every wise suggestion she whispered, every healing broth she prepared, Conrad felt the foundation of everything he had believed about her, and about himself, shift irrevocably. He had come to her for help with reading, but she was giving him back his power, his dignity, and forcing him to see a truth he had been too blind to accept. The study, once a place of dread for Conrad, became their war room. By day, Hela was his calm-voiced reader, her finger tracing the lines of text that unlocked the world for him. But in the stolen moments, when he pretended to be resting or when the castle grew quiet, she became something else entirely. A hunter. Her mind, sharp and methodical, began connecting threads he couldn't even see. While reading him a dull report on grain storage, her eyes would catch on a tiny notation. "This shipment was logged by Lucas's personal guard," she would murmur, almost to herself. "Strange, that's not their usual duty." She started cross-referencing. She'd pull out financial ledgers under the guise of checking tax records, and Conrad would watch, mesmerized, as her finger moved down columns of numbers. "Here," she said one evening, her voice tight with excitement. She pointed to an entry. A withdrawal from the packed treasury, signed by Lucas, for security upgrades. Then she laid another document beside it. A trade manifest she'd secretly borrowed from the archives. And here, a payment from a shell company to an apothecary in the eastern marshes, known for one thing. She looked up at him, her one good eye blazing with intensity. Shadow's kiss. Conrad felt a cold fury begin to replace his shame. This wasn't a wild accusation anymore. This was evidence. She didn't stop there. While walking in the courtyard for fresh air, she would pause to speak with a stable hand, a cook, an old warrior. She asked gentle questions, her Omega status making her seem harmless. "It must have been so frightening at the ceremony," she'd say sympathetically. "I heard Lucas fought so bravely." And from these conversations, she gathered whispers. A guard mentioned Lucas had reassigned the patrols that night. A servant recalled Lucas insisting on tasting the wine himself from a different amphora, a grand show of brotherly loyalty that now seemed deeply suspicious. Conrad watched her, and the way he saw her fundamentally changed. This was not just a healer or a reader. This was a strategist, a woman of immense courage and a brilliant, analytical mind. The word tribute felt hollow and insulting now. She was his equal, perhaps even his superior, in this shadow war. Then, the fever came. The untreated lash marks on her back, strained by her constant work, became infected. One night, she collapsed over a pile of correspondence, her skin burning to the touch. Conrad carried her to the small cot he'd had placed in his study. He dismissed the servants. He, the Alpha, spent the night by her bedside, pressing cool cloths to her forehead and watching her tremble. In her delirium, she didn't speak of revenge or fear. She muttered about herb ratios, about strengthening his heart, about the look in Lucas's eyes in the garden. It was in the quiet, pre-dawn hours, as her fever finally broke and her breathing eased, that the full staggering weight of her sacrifice crashed down upon him. She had endured torture, imprisonment, and now this agony, all for a man who had threatened to punish her. He was holding a cup of water to her lips when her eyes fluttered open, clear and aware. She was weak, but her gaze was steady on his. A question he had been unable to form finally broke free. His voice was rough with a confusion of emotions, guilt, awe, a desperate need to understand. "Why?" he asked, the single word holding all his turmoil. "I promised you punishment. I called you a liar. Why did you save me? Why do you do any of this?" Hela looked at him, not at the alpha, but at the man. There was no calculation in her eyes, no desire for reward. Only a simple, devastating truth. "Because you're worth saving," she whispered. The words, quiet as they were, shattered the last of his defenses. They broke through a lifetime of pride and solitary leadership. They flooded the cracks in his heart, washing away the last remnants of his doubt. He had built his identity on strength and power, but it was her quiet, stubborn devotion that truly undid him. In that moment, holding the water for the broken woman who had given everything for him, Conrad knew. Everything had changed. The air in the castle had become a thin, sharp blade. With only 3 days until the council's vote, every shadow seemed to hold its breath. Lucas's supporters moved through the halls with a new, smug assurance, and Conrad could feel the trap tightening. He and Hela had taken to eating their meals in his study, their sanctuary having become their fortress. A kitchen maid, her eyes downcast, brought in the evening tray. It was a rich stew, the scent of meat and herbs filling the room. As had become their unspoken ritual, Hela picked up the spoon before Conrad could. She would taste everything, a silent, steadfast shield. She took a small bite, chewed, swallowed. For a moment, nothing. Then, her eyes widened. A strangled gasp escaped her lips as the spoon clattered to the floor. She clutched her throat, her body seizing as she slid from her chair. "Hela!" Conrad was on his knees in an instant, catching her as she convulsed. Her body arched against him, a violent, terrifying tremor racking her frame. Her face, just moments before serene in its determination, was now contorted in agony. Foam, tinged with pink, appeared at the corners of her mouth. The world narrowed to this single, horrifying point. The poison meant for him was now burning through her, the woman who had already given him back his life, his dignity, and his purpose. The full, staggering truth of her love and loyalty exploded within him. A love so profound, she would willingly drink death for him. "No, no," he roared, the sound raw with a terror he had never known. He gathered her limp, shaking body into his arms, her slight form feeling frighteningly fragile. He burst from the study, shouting for a healer, but he didn't wait. He ran through the corridors himself, his heart a frantic, broken drum in his chest, carrying her to the healer's wing as if he could outrun the death clinging to her. He refused to leave her bedside. He held her hand, his own large ones trembling, wiping the foam from her lips, whispering her name, begging her to fight. The healers worked, but it was Conrad's presence that was a constant, desperate anchor. Rage and grief warred inside him, a white-hot fury at his brother's bottomless treachery, and a crushing, suffocating grief for his own stubborn blindness that had brought her to this moment. As the healer stabilized her, leaving her in a deep, unnatural sleep, Conrad's frantic energy needed an outlet. His eyes fell on the small satchel she kept in the study, the one that held all her notes. With hands that shook, he spilled its contents onto a nearby table. There were the financial records, the coded correspondence, the witness statements, the brilliant, meticulous evidence of Lucas's plot. But beneath it all, he found a small, leather-bound journal. His breath caught. These were her private words. He opened it. The script was elegant, clear. He struggled with the letters, but the words, once he pieced them together, lanced straight through his soul. "I saw him today, defending the widow Orla. They all look at his strength, but I see the weight on his shoulders. It is a good weight. He carries it for them. He thinks I resent my fate. He does not know I begged my parents to send me. The taxes were impossible. If I did not come, my younger brother and sister would have been taken to the mines to pay the debt. This way they eat. This way they are safe. A trade I would make 1,000 times. I love him. It is a foolish, hopeless thing. An omega loving her alpha. But I cannot help it. He is worth every silent, aching moment. Tears he had not shed since he was a boy welled in his eyes, blurring the painfully honest words. He read them aloud, his voice halting, broken, giving sound to her secret heart. He was still reading, her journal clutched in his hands, when a weak whisper came from the bed. "You found them." Conrad's head snapped up. Hela was awake, her eyes hazy with pain and antidotes, but fixed on him, on the journal in his hands. He moved to her side, dropping to his knees so his face was level with hers. The tears he could no longer contain traced paths through the grime of fear and grief on his face. "You saved your siblings," he breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "You took this fate to feed them." She gave a slow, painful blink of acknowledgement. "And you love me," he whispered, the words a revelation, a prayer. Her gaze was steady, filled with a truth more potent than any poison. How could I not? In the quiet of the healer's wing, with the evidence of a conspiracy on one table and the proof of a boundless heart in his hands, Alpha Conrad finally, fully saw. The tribute he had been given was not a payment. She was the greatest treasure his pack, or he, would ever know. And he would burn the world to the ground before he let anyone take her from him again. The great hall was packed, a sea of tense, uncertain faces. Whispers swirled like ghosts in the air. The entire pack had been summoned, and they all felt the weight of the moment. Conrad stood on the raised dais, not as the fully recovered Alpha, but as a man still leaning slightly on a spear for support. And beside him, for all to see, stood Hela. Her posture was straight, her chin lifted, but the faded bruises on her face and the raw burns around her wrists were a silent, brutal testimony to all she had endured. Conrad's voice, though weaker than its former roar, carried a new, unshakable authority. He did not shout. He simply began to speak, laying out the truth like a hunter skinning a kill. He held up the financial records. "This," he announced, "is a withdrawal from our pack treasury, signed by my brother, for security that was never built." He then held up the trade manifest. "And this is a payment from a hidden company to an Eastern Marsh apothecary, for a poison called Shadow's Kiss." He looked directly at Lucas, who stood smirking with his arms crossed. "The same poison that was in my wine at the mating ceremony." A ripple of shock went through the crowd. Lucas laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Fairy tales. Fabrications put together by a bitter Omega who tried to kill you and a weak Alpha who would believe any lie to hide his own inadequacies." His eyes swept the crowd, inviting them to share his scorn. But Conrad was ready. He called forward the stable hand, who confirmed Lucas had changed the patrols. He called the servant, who described Lucas's theatrical wine tasting. Each testimony was another stone in the wall of truth. "He lies!" Lucas shouted, his mask of amusement finally cracking to reveal the fury beneath. "He cannot even read the documents he claims are evidence. He is unfit. He is broken." The air grew thick. The pack was dividing before their eyes. Then Conrad did something no one expected. He threw the spear he was leaning on. It clattered to the stone floor between him and his brother. "The law is clear," Conrad's voice rang out, tapping into the pack's most ancient traditions. "When truth is disputed, the old way decides. I challenge you, Lucas. Trial by combat. Let the moon goddess grant victory to the one who speaks for her." A collective gasp filled the hall. Conrad was still pale, still weakened. Lucas was fresh, strong, and hungry for power. It was a death sentence. But as Conrad stepped down from the dais, he didn't look at his brother. He looked at Hela. Her eyes met his, filled not with fear, but with a fierce, unwavering faith. She gave a single, slow nod. The antidotes she had given him, the herbs that still flowed in his veins, were her silent contribution to this fight. The battle was not the graceful dance of warriors. It was a brutal, ugly brawl. Lucas fought with the slick, dirty tricks of an assassin, aiming for Conrad's weakened legs, his still tender side. Conrad fought with the raw, desperate strength of an Alpha, protecting everything he loved: his pack, his future, his true mate. Every time Lucas's blows landed, sending jolts of agony through Conrad's body, He thought of Hela in the dungeon, of her whispered confession, of her love that had saved him again and again. That love became his strength. As Lucas lunged for a killing blow, Conrad moved with a speed that shocked everyone. He wasn't fighting for pride anymore. He was fighting for her. He caught Lucas's arm, twisted it, and with a roar that came from the depths of his soul, he threw his brother to the ground, pinning him with a knee to his chest. The hall was utterly silent. Conrad, breathing in ragged, painful gasps, looked down at his brother's hate-filled face. His hand tightened around Lucas's throat. The pack waited for the killing bite. It never came. Conrad leaned close, his voice a low, thunderous promise for Lucas alone. "I do not kill my own blood, but you are no longer part of this pack. You and your corrupt council friends," he said, his gaze sweeping to Thorin and the others, who shrank back, "are banished. You will leave these lands with nothing but the clothes on your backs. If any of you ever set foot here again, you will be executed on sight." He released Lucas and stood, turning to face his people. He was bleeding, battered, but he stood tall, the true alpha restored not by brute force, but by justice and mercy. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the back of the hall, an old warrior, one who had served Conrad's father, slammed his fist over his heart. Then another and another. The gesture spread, a wave of acceptance and loyalty that crashed through the great hall. They had seen the evidence. They had witnessed the trial. They had seen their leader's strength and his mercy. The threat was over. The pack was his. And as Hela stepped forward to stand at his side, Conrad knew his real reign was only just beginning. The great hall was silent, every eye fixed on the dais where Conrad stood, Hela, a steady presence beside him. The air still hummed with the recent energy of banishment and victory, but now a new profound quiet had fallen. Conrad looked out at his people, not as an untouchable leader, but as one of them. "My pack," he began, his voice clear and carrying. "For too long, I have led you with one hand tied behind my back. I have carried a secret, believing it was a weakness that would make me unworthy to stand before you." He took a deep breath, the admission costing him more than any battle ever had. "The written word has always been a locked door to me. The letters move. They swim on the page. I cannot read them." A stunned murmur rippled through the crowd. The mighty Alpha Conrad. Illiterate? He held up a hand, not in command, but in request for understanding. "I thought my strength alone was enough, but strength without wisdom is just noise, and I was blind." He turned to Hela, his gaze softening. "She was the key. This Omega, who you were told was a tribute, who you saw as less than nothing, was the one who unlocked the world for me. She read your petitions. She helped me understand your needs. She stood beside me when everyone else turned away, and with her mind and her courage, she helped me save this pack from a snake that was poisoning it from within." He looked back at the pack, his expression fierce with a new kind of truth. "I have learned that strength is not just in the muscle or the claw. It is in the mind, it is in the heart, and true leadership is not about hiding your weaknesses, but about having the courage to accept help from those whose strengths complement your own." Then, he did what no alpha had ever done. He turned fully to Hela and took both of her hands in his, holding them up for all to see. He didn't hide the silver burns that circled her wrists like brutal jewelry. He showed them as badges of her honor. "Hela," he said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate yet carrying to the farthest corner of the hall. "Your tribute status is ended. It is erased, as if it never was. You owe this pack nothing. You owe me nothing." He went down on one knee. The collective gasp was audible. An alpha, kneeling to an omega. "The choice is yours, and only yours," he said, his gray eyes fixed on hers, shining with unshed tears. "After all I have put you through, after my blindness and my pride, will you be my mate? Not because a debt forced you here, but because your heart chooses to stay. I promise you, I will spend every day of my life striving to be a man worthy of your sacrifice and of the incredible love you have so freely given me." The silence in the hall was absolute. You could have heard a pin drop. Hela looked down at the powerful warrior on his knees before her. She saw the man who had defended widows, comforted children, and just now bared his soul to his entire pack for her. All the pain, the fear, the desperation, it melted away, leaving only a pure, soaring joy. Tears streamed down her face, but she was smiling, a radiant, beautiful smile that lit up the entire hall. "My heart has always chosen you, Conrad," she said, her voice strong and clear. "It always will." A roar of approval erupted from the pack. A wave of sound so powerful it shook the very stones of the castle. It was not a cheer of obedience, but of celebration. They were witnessing something new, something legendary being born before their eyes. Their mating ceremony, held a week later, was unlike any other. It wasn't just a union of two people, but the celebration of a new kind of strength for the entire pack. It was the story of the tribute who saved her alpha, and the alpha who learned that true power lies in vulnerability, trust, and partnership. The story closes where it truly began, in Conrad's study. The fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Hela sat in a comfortable chair, a scroll in her hands, her voice a soft, steady rhythm as she read a petition from a farmer. Conrad sat beside her, his large frame relaxed, his focus entirely on her words. His hand rested over hers on the parchment, his thumb gently stroking the scars on her wrist, a constant, tender acknowledgement of all they had survived. They were both still healing, in their bodies and in their spirits. But in that quiet room, surrounded by the peaceful business of leading their pack together, they were, finally and completely, home. If you enjoyed this story, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, plus your favorite moment and character. I really love hearing your thoughts and chatting with you. Until the next love story, bye for now.